questo microfono qui va...
Hello, good morning. Could you sit down, please? Please. So, good morning, everybody. I hope that the people that came yesterday for the pizza party didn't stay too late, and that you are awake. And if you are not awake, I think that our friend Philip Willan will make you awake, because he's a journalist with a lot to tell, lot of story to tell you, because he's an expert in terrorism, in parapolitics. He has been doing many research in cold case and in political mysteries. He has contributed to books regarding the death of the Pope Giovanni Paolo I, and he is actually still searching and doing some investigation on the case, Moro case, that maybe some of you we may remember, the president of the Democratic Party that was kidnapped and killed by the Red Brigades. So he has a lot to tell. Maybe you will not tell everything because you have to buy his books, but please consider that he's a prominent journalist from the foreign press. He has been the president of the Foreign Press Club here in Rome for many years. So I leave the floor to Philip Willan, and I hope that you enjoy his talk. Thank you.
Good morning. As Giorgio was saying, I have been a journalist for a very long time, and almost my entire career has been spent in Italy, and I've been particularly fascinated by the mysteries of Italy's Cold War history, which still remain very mysterious in many cases. So there's a very rich vein of information to be mined there for journalists and historians and researchers. I work as a freelance journalist, and the newspaper that I collaborate most frequently with now is The Times. Their main correspondent here is Tom Kington, who's an extremely able and active colleague who has moved Italy up on the news agenda as far as the newspaper is concerned. There were periods in the past when, for one reason or another, Italy was of less interest to readers and newspaper editors in the UK, but Tom is extremely active and has established a niche at the paper where on an average day there would be at least one article from him, and sometimes two or three, reflecting very considerable interest in Italy, and of course the Vatican as well, which is part of our beat here. Working for the paper, the normal sort of daily procedure is that you read as many newspapers as you can in the morning, and you're expected to propose stories to the foreign desk by around 10 o'clock Italian time. So it's a bit of a scramble, particularly if you're not accustomed to getting up early. Normally you would aim to propose between 3 and 6 topics to the editors, and then they would inform you in the course of the morning what they would like you to write about, and they always tell you the word count that they want. So you have clear instructions of what sort of space is going to be available in the paper for your piece. I've managed to connect to the website of the newspaper, so you can just see what the topics are in today's paper. This is the front page, and obviously local British news is to the fore, and would tend to be, on an average day, the front page stories would tend to be dominated by British news. And of course, with a brand new Prime Minister and a certain amount of political chaos, which has seen Britain being compared to Italy from the point of view of its political chaos, the new Prime Minister is top of the news agenda. We can have a look and see what the paper is focusing on in its foreign news pages, and then also have a look at what the commentators have been writing about. So the top world news story is Germany's plan to legalize cannabis, a model for Europe. The foreign news can be all over the place. The United States obviously tends to be a very important subject for the foreign news, and obviously the war in Ukraine. It's possible that the British world news coverage of the quality papers in Britain is more wide-ranging than Italian newspapers' foreign coverage, partly because of the Britain's ties with its former colonies and the fact that the British Empire is a more recent phenomenon than the Roman Empire. So there's a very wide interest in really the whole globe, whereas I think Italian newspapers tend to be focused on a narrower range of countries that have a direct relevance for Italy and Europe. All stories for the paper it's a good thing if they're entertaining. So a lot of the stories chosen both from the foreign news and also domestic news, if there's a sort of humorous aspect to the story, then the editors are likely to find that appealing. Italy tends to be a good source of light stories that offer light relief, and so editors are often appeal to the person who's on duty in Italy to come up with a light, entertaining story when the rest of the news is very grim, as is very often the case these days. Reporting from Italy, obviously the politics has a certain amount of interest, but the degree of interest can fluctuate. If there's a new government or a particularly chaotic phase of politics, then the British newspapers will be interested. If you have someone like Romano Prodi governing in a sensible way for a few years, then that topic is not going to be of particular appeal to English readers. Crime is always a good staple from Italy, and the Vatican, as I said, both from the point of view of religious news relating to the Catholic Church and also the many scandals that have affected the Vatican in recent years, financial scandals, particularly the investment in property in London that has caused a lot of interest and controversy. And culture is a major topic from Italy, and a story about a new discovery in Pompeii, or any sort of cultural story which can be illustrated with attractive photographs will be immediately snapped up by the editors in London. And obviously Italy generates possibly more stories of that type than any other country in the world. So that's a big plus for someone pitching proposals from Italy for the day's news. We could just have a quick look at the what the topics were in the comment pages. So the top story was why Qatar makes this football fan so uneasy, and it's an interesting article by David Aronovich about the authoritarian regime in Qatar and the lack of respect for human rights, particularly the rights of gay people, and pointing out how this country, which has no significant history in connection with football, but a lot of money, has been chosen to host the games this year. And there's an interesting comment by someone who says he's a keen football fan himself, but he feels guilty even watching the matches on television, and would certainly never go to Qatar for the World Cup. The other topics, deep down, the Tories know taxes will rise. Obviously, UK politics at the top of the agenda. Truss proves talent-free bluster isn't just for men. More politics, and then sort of general social comment. So the kind of mix that you would expect from a quality newspaper alongside the Daily Telegraph or the Guardian, the same sort of makeup of the pages. In the case of the Times, the political slant of the paper, one could probably describe as conservative with a small c, not to be confused with large C, Conservative Party, but generally socially conservative, but open to a wide range of views. And obviously to some extent influenced by the views of the owner, Rupert Murdoch, billionaire Australian magnate who's now an American citizen, and who certainly would tend to have conservative views and sort of pro-capitalist views, having made a great deal of money out of the current Western capitalist system. So this is my, one could say, my day job, and I switch between writing for the Times from time to time to researching a book, which, as Giorgio mentioned, the topic I'm working on at the moment is the kidnapping of Aldo Moro, and I don't know how many of you would be aware that his body was left in the boot of a car here in Via Caetani, just outside where you're sitting at the moment. The research for investigative books is the aspect of journalism that appeals to me most and offers the greatest satisfaction, in my opinion. And my introduction to that kind of work came many years ago when I saw a notice on the board in the Foreign Press Club because a British author, David Yallop, was looking for a researcher to help him research a book, which turned out to be his book on the murder, in inverted commas, of Pope John Paul I. And that was a very revealing introduction to the murkier side of Italy's Cold War history, the Vatican, Vatican finances, Freemasonry, the P2 Masonic Lodge, the anti-communist struggle of that period, all came into this story about the mysterious death of the Pope after 33 days in office, whether he was poisoned, or whether he really died of a heart attack, or maybe perhaps more likely he suffered a stroke. My own personal take on it was that when I started the research, I was very skeptical of Yallop's theory, but clearly he didn't start or propose a book and start major research on it without having some sort of input that encouraged him to believe that he was heading in the right direction. In the course of the research, I moved from being skeptical to being fairly convinced that something strange had happened, and that if the Vatican was covering up details of what actually happened in the death of the Pope, and providing details that were simply not true, or different sources were contradicting one another, it gave the impression that they must be covering up something important, because they wouldn't go to the trouble of lying if there wasn't an important reason for doing it. But when the book was published, I worked on a television documentary, and we went around and re-interviewed some of the key sources for the book, and the documentary was broadcast on British television by Granada Television. And I remember being particularly struck that we interviewed a very senior Italian journalist who was the sort of dean of the Vatican press corps. And when we explained what Gallup's thesis was, and the fact that he attached a lot of significance to the fact that the Vatican had given incorrect information, for example, as to who discovered the body, and in reality it appears it was the nun who he had a very close, long-lasting connection with, but in order to save embarrassment about revealing that a woman had gone into the Pope's bedroom, they said it was one of the secretaries, and there was confusion about what documents he was holding in his hand, or he'd been reading in the evening before he died. And this Italian journalist said, well, you can tell that Gallup doesn't know anything about the Vatican, because he sees it as being very significant that the Vatican officials have lied about this, about the exact circumstances of the death. And he said, the reality is that the Vatican lies every day as a matter of routine. And I wasn't sure which was more shocking, that people in the Vatican had killed the Pope, or that they lied every day as a matter of routine. It's a toss-up there. But anyway, that experience introduced me to the role of the Vatican and the Vatican Bank in the mysterious period of history in Italy after the war, and the many shady things that needed doing to ensure that the Communist Party did not achieve power through the ballot box. And the next investigative project that I worked on was a book of my own called Puppet Masters, which is about the manipulation of terrorism in Italy after the Second World War. After that, I did research for a book about the Banco Ambrosiano, and Roberto Calvi, the Italian banker who was found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London from scaffolding. And again, that brought me back to the Vatican, the close relationship between the Banco Ambrosiano and the Vatican Bank. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the American head of the Vatican Bank, and it was another sort of step into this very murky world of Freemasons, wealthy individuals, secret services, foreign secret services, a really fascinating mix with people who effectively wrote a really extraordinary story in the Western country with the largest communist party in the Western world, a frontier country, a country bordering on communist Yugoslavia, jutting out into the Mediterranean, so a very useful geostrategic position as unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean, and a country where all sorts of international forces met and competed and were vying for power. So that was that has really been the topic of my life's work, one could say. And having done the book on terrorism, I moved on to do a book myself on the Calvi case, which I updated a few years ago, and it is called The Vatican at War, because the focus is very much on how important the context of Calvi's life and death was in trying to understand who killed him, whether he was killed. There are people who argue that he committed suicide because his bank had gone bankrupt, and he was desperate, and so he hanged himself in a rather agile and acrobatic manner from the scaffolding under Blackfriars Bridge. But the trials that have been were celebrated in Rome a few years ago, although they were unable to identify who definitely was responsible for his murder, the courts here in Italy did say they believed he definitely was killed. So the context in which he was operating, and whether desperate to save his bank, he was trying to blackmail people to save his career and his bank, and whether that activity led to the people threatened by the revelations that he could make, explain who wanted him killed, and therefore also who carried out the murder. All of that is a fascinating story, and still one of the many mysteries from this period of Italian history. In the course of the research that I did for my own books, I interviewed Licio Gelli, the head of the P2 Masonic Lodge, on a number of occasions, and in a sense those interviews were the most interesting, sort of fascinating insight into that period of history. Licio Gelli was a former fascist, or in fact an unrepentant fascist, and he became head of this very influential Masonic lodge, Propaganda 2, which was a meeting place for the Italian elite and people who, the membership was secret, so people who didn't want the fact that they were members to be known, very important people in politics or business who didn't want to be bothered by other Masons asking them for favors, would join the lodge. In that period, Catholics who became Freemasons risked excommunication. So senior members of the church who might want to join the lodge would also join P2 rather than another lodge, because the fact of their joining the lodge would be kept secret. The first time that I went to meet Jelly, it was quite an intimidating experience, and I went on my own just at the beginning of towards the beginning of my journalistic career, and his reputation was such that it was natural to feel a bit nervous discussing sensitive things and terrorism and murder and events where he was suspected of having pulled the strings. On one occasion, I went and interviewed him with Charles Raw, who wrote a book on the Banco Ambrosiano case, very detailed, lengthy tome, based in part on his access to the papers of the bankruptcy of the Banco Ambrosiano in Luxembourg, I believe, and one of the affiliates of the Banco Ambrosiano. And so when we interviewed Jelly about his involvement in the Banco Ambrosiano affair, which resulted in a lot of money leaving the Banco Ambrosiano and ending up in his accounts, Charles Raw asked him about various episodes in his financial dealings with the Banco Ambrosiano. And Jelly, if the subject matter of the question was embarrassing, he had no problem at all in just lying flatly. And Charles Raw had the financial documents that proved what had happened, and Jelly simply denied and dismissed the questions that Raw put to him. And at the end of the interview in Jelly's villa near Arezzo, we went out into the garden and posed for photographs together, all smiling and friendly. And as he was saluting us as we were about to leave, Jelly said to Charles Raw that if he was ever in the neighborhood in Tuscany, he should come in for a cup of coffee, and he would do the same when he was in London. And there was no question of Raw voluntarily revealing his address or where he lived, and this farewell comment had a kind of mafia ring to it. It was quite it was an interesting moment, let's say. And subsequently, I did other interviews with Jelly with television colleagues, and the content of those interviews became quite important for Italy's history, because in his later years, Jelly was living in retirement near Arezzo, and he became increasingly relaxed about the topics that he wouldn't have said anything about 10 or 15 or 20 years earlier. And one of the interesting things about my dealings with him is that my impression is that he had no difficulty at all in lying about things where the subject matter was potentially embarrassing for him. But if he told you a story that was embarrassing for other people, then very often those stories were true, possibly always. There was the episode of the Conto Protezione, money deposited in Switzerland on behalf of the Socialist Party and Socialist Party leaders. Jelly was the first person to refer to this scandal. It took years to establish who the money belonged to. And finally, what Jelly had said years earlier turned out to be true. So I think if he made revelations that were awkward for other people, there was a very good chance that what he was saying was true. And these television interviews sort of entered the historic record at a later stage, because the material that we recorded was used by Mentana in his program on La Sette when Jelly died, and so a lot of material in which Jelly, from other sources as well, but material in which Jelly talked to us about right-wing coup plots and his role in the period of right-wing terrorism and coup plots, was broadcast by La Sette in a program that was put together by Mentana, and it then came to be used in the Bologna station bombing trial, and it was shown to the court and to the jury to help to explain the political and historic context surrounding the bombing of the station in 1980. And another fragment of an interview that I did with a German colleague became particularly important, because I asked him about a document that was confiscated from Jelly when he was arrested in a bank in Switzerland. And the document outlines a number of financial transactions and payments to different individuals. And the heading of the document is an account number and the word Bologna. And the prosecutors in the Bologna bomb trial became convinced that this was an accounting for the payments and the money that financed the Bologna station bombing, and that's what they sought to demonstrate in the trial. And I think they did a pretty good job, although the last stretch of the payments between Jelly and the money in many cases came from the Banco Ambrosiano originally. The last passage of money from the people identified in Jelly's piece of paper to the people who are credibly suspected of having actually carried out the bombing, that last passage remains to be fully demonstrated. But years earlier, we had been to interview Jelly, and I had asked him about this document, and I had a copy of it with me, and I stood up and walked over to show it to him. And it's the only time that he was ever asked about this document. And he just waved it away and said he didn't want to look at it. His lawyers had advised him not to talk about it. And he just dismissed it. But he did then make some comments about one of the people whose names was on the list, which indicated he knew this person very well. And he even said that this person, Marco Ceruti, would not be returning to Italy, and he was living abroad at that time, which seemed like a significant thing to say. And my understanding is that Ceruti lives in Florida now, and he avoided questioning by the Bologna magistrates but for health reasons that I think it was said that he wasn't, he's very elderly now and he wasn't sufficiently lucid to undergo an interrogation. But anyway, this research and these meetings and these interviews took on a whole new significance in light of the Bologna bomb trial and this new approach to trying to explain what happened. Before we go to questions, I should perhaps just add that in terms of the personal satisfaction of doing this kind of work, doing research, aiming to break new ground and rewrite the history of a country like Italy, it is a great source of satisfaction if you can actually achieve something. So if any of you are thinking of going into journalism, this is a good aspect of what we do. And it occurred to me that the relevance and importance of this kind of work was underlined by the debate in Parliament in the last day or two, where a former prosecutor from Palermo, who's been elected as a senator for the Five-Star movement, Roberto Scarpinato, made a speech about how fascism and neo-fascism fit into the story of terrorism and terrorist atrocities and mafia power in Italy since the war, and clearly accusing Giorgia Meloni's political world of being in some way related to that. And of course, Meloni herself and her supporters dismissed this as unproven nonsense. But the fact is that the history of Italy is so peppered with unsolved mysteries that in order for people to know what to make of Scarpinato's speech, we need to know a lot more about what happened. And a huge number of these mysterious episodes have remained absolutely clouded in fog. So if researchers and historians and journalists can break new ground on this particular story, it will help the country to move forward and to know who's telling the truth when people clash in Parliament on a topic like this. And the very last thing that I would say in general terms about journalism, particularly for people of your generation, is that in the Western world now there's a really big deficit of trust in general in society. People don't believe what the politicians say, they don't believe what the journalists say. There's a huge amount of confusing information available on the internet, there's QAnon, and it means that people who do credible, believable journalism provide a very useful service for society. And given the state of confusion and mistrust that characterize society today, if people can make a contribution as authoritative, believable sources, clarifying what's really happening in the world or what has happened in the world, then they deserve to be paid better and some applause. So I'm happy to take any questions. I'll perhaps move on to one of the other microphones to...
I'll move it around.
Yes, but I'll perhaps answer on another one if they work. One of the ones from there. You choose whoever. If you put your hands up and.
First of all, thank you for being here. My name is Francesco Mastidoro. I'm a student of global governance at the University of Rome Tor Vergata. I have two questions for you. So the first one, you said that you dealt and you are still dealing with big cases. You dealt with the death of Aldo Moro, the death of a pope. I guess that in dealing with such cases, you face many obstacles. Maybe you face threats. You receive threats from some people who do not want you to find the truth, or perhaps you face the reticence of some officials, some people who don't want to talk, so you can't find the truth. So can you tell us a little bit more about these obstacles and the obstacles that you personally faced? The second question is referred to the last part of your speech. You said that it's referring to the speech in the Italian Parliament. It's very important to find the truth when it comes to big cases and our past, the Italian past. So this morning, while coming here, I came across an article about Enrico Mattei. That is one of the big cases of Italy. For those of you who don't know, Enrico Mattei was an Italian entrepreneur. He was the president of Agip and then Eni. And I personally, and many people consider it as one of the best entrepreneurs in Italy, and a very important and someone who we should be proud of as Italians. Do you have something to tell us about Enrico Mattei? Did you follow this case, or do you know something we don't know? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. It's right that investigating sensitive topics is potentially dangerous, and a number of journalists have been killed in Italy over the course of the years. Perhaps the most famous example is Mino Pecorelli, who ran a very well-informed political magazine called OP, Osservatore Politico, and he was shot dead in Rome in, I think it was 1979. He had very good sources, including in the secret services, and some people characterized his work as sort of bordering on blackmail, the kind of sensitive information that he had, that he would publish or not publish, depending on whether people paid him. But his career has been reevaluated in recent years, and I think increasingly there's a belief that he was a very good journalist who paid with his life for his desire to publish and to reveal the sensitive information that he was able to uncover. In the course of my own work, I was obviously aware that these were sensitive topics, and particularly in the early years when we were much closer to the events, and the historical context and political context was also closer to the context in which these things happened. One was aware that the subject matter was sensitive and potentially dangerous. I didn't, on the whole, find that I was personally and openly, overtly threatened by people in the course of the research. But there was one aspect of the Moro case and its connection to the Banda della Magliana and Tony Ciccarelli, a figure who was a falsario, a counterfeiter who worked for the important Rome crime gang, and I can't remember now exactly who it was, or possibly a lawyer who was representing a client involved in this case. And this person said to me very clearly that if you continue down this line of inquiry, ti spareranno in bocca. And that was quite discouraging. And I've never felt that I would willingly sacrifice my life for the purpose of this kind of research. So that was a subject that I sort of rolled back on a bit, because it clearly was at that time still very sensitive. I think the situation has changed now, and the geopolitical position of Italy in the world and the Cold War is over, and so a lot of these old stories are history and archaeology, and they're not current politics. But there is that aspect, and everyone has to decide for themselves what degree of risk they are prepared to run, and when the situation looks too dangerous, and whether you step back at that point. But on the whole, apart from sort of coded messages like Jelly's message to Charles Raw, I haven't personally experienced direct credible threats in the course of my work, and I think it's, crossing my fingers, it's increasingly unlikely now. The fact that Jelly relaxed about these topics over the years that I had contact with him was a sign that huge, significant secrets from the past were no longer huge and no longer so significant, although they're obviously significant in terms of our understanding of the period. On Mattei, I haven't personally looked in any detail into the Mattei case, but it is a very interesting case, and I think it's interesting to compare Mattei with Olivetti, the two entrepreneurs who were helping Italy to become a major player in terms of energy for Mattei, threatening the interests of the Seven Sisters, the major Western oil companies, encouraging independence movements in Algeria, offering a better deal to the exporting countries, and basically upsetting the status quo in terms of power and money at that time. And Olivetti, who developed very competitive computer technology that, if he had lived and his dream of what he was aiming to achieve in that sector had been able to continue, Italy might have been a much more powerful player in the sector of information technology. So as a sort of medium-sized, medium-important power that fought on the losing side of the war, Italy's post-war history has been conditioned by that, and I think the Mattei case in particular is an example of a striving for autonomy in a particularly important sector of human activity was thwarted, and again, we don't know exactly who killed Mattei, but the recent investigation in Pavia concluded he definitely his plane crashed because there was a bomb on board.
Hello, my name is Francesca Primavilla. I'm as well a second-year GG student. And my question is, well, sources are at the basic core of journalism, especially truthful ones. And as you were talking, it came to my mind the French historian Marc Bloch, an historian from the 19th and 20th century. And he claimed that historians, just as judges, shouldn't trust people's memory. In fact, people's memory is often lacking, missing some points, and sometimes even misleading. And so, in that regard, I was wondering, what is the point of view of a journalist in relation to first-hand sources, as people's memory is, and what is the source that you mostly rely on? Thank you.
Yes, I think there's no question that written, reliable official sources from the time are a fundamental piece of the jigsaw, although official documents may also not tell the truth or not tell the whole truth, or be eliminated from the record, but because they might reveal embarrassing truths. I happened to see a documentary on La Sette, I think it was 2 evenings ago, actually about the Mattei case. And one of the interesting things that the prosecutor who investigated the case, Vincenzo Callia, revealed was that eyewitnesses to the crash had told varying stories about what they had seen. And initially the account was that people had seen a fire in the sky and the plane had fallen, i.e. there'd been an explosion in the air. And one of the key witnesses, though, changed his story the next day. And he said, yes, I saw flames, but it was after the plane was on the ground. And the prosecutor said that in the course of his research, he had gathered together newspaper articles and photographs and television and film material. And he had found material from Rai, who had interviewed this particularly important eyewitness to the crash, who'd been interviewed also by the Corriere della Sera. And so the next day, the account was his original account that he'd seen an explosion or a fire in the sky. And the prosecutor found material in the Rai archives of this original interview done also by Rai immediately after the event. And he found that the archive had footage of the interview with this man who was a farmer, and is a very simple individual. So that there was the video images of the interview, and at certain points in the interview, the audio was missing. And in the most significant parts of what he was saying, and which was the original account that he'd seen flames in the sky, the audio had been eliminated by somebody who'd gone into the the Rai archive. And obviously he found that particularly significant, that somebody had taken the trouble to eliminate the most sensitive parts of the testimony, and also someone who had access to the archives, not available to everyone, and also had the technical expertise to do it. And he then got a deaf person to lip read the bits of video where the audio was missing, and so he was able to fill in the missing audio with a lip reader, which I thought was a very interesting anecdote, on how much was done to suppress inconvenient truths, and how important it is to look everywhere and re-look at things that have been looked at before. But on the more general question, I think it's particularly interesting. It's true that eyewitness accounts are, by definition, unreliable to some extent, and you have to make up your own mind about the credibility of the witnesses that you speak to. That's part of being a journalist or a researcher, that assessing the reliability of the people you talk to, comparing what they say with the accounts of other sources. And it's particularly interesting if you're researching old stories which coincide with roughly the lifespan of the witnesses. In the case of the Calvi murder, the magistrates the prosecutor who brought the case, interviewed a lot of witnesses leading up to the trial, and some people died before he could get to them. And a good number of them, particularly people who didn't want to recall what had happened, said that they couldn't remember. And if somebody is aged in their 70s or 80s, the events happened 30 or 40 years earlier, they can say they don't remember anything, and you can't say that they're lying, although they may well be lying because they're still frightened. And obviously, after a very long passage of time, people don't remember, or they maybe remember things that didn't happen. So, all the different sources of information have to be weighed and compared with one another and put together to make the most plausible account of what you're talking about.
Okay. So
maybe I should be quicker in my responses.
I hope. Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Anyway, my question. My name is Elia Malitzi, and first of all, and my question, it's quite related to some questions of my colleagues, but it's a little bit fast. How Anglo-Saxon historians or Anglo-Saxons, I mean, in general, English-speaking historians and journalists consider in general Italy's role during the Cold War. I'm asking this question to you because in order to understand why it's so difficult to make certain research work on several on events like Aldomaro's death, Calvi's death, or several unsolved cases like the Italicos or the Ustica accidents. They are most of the times completely unsolved, and my sensation is that there are cases where that Italy somehow conserves more cases like this than most of European countries, and not consider USA. I know there are some historians like, or in general scholars like Joseph La Palombara that made a lot of research on how Italian politics actually worked in the first 40 years. That's the point, more or less.
Yes, I think that possibly Anglo-Saxon observers of Italy have an advantage in that it's easier for them to be impartial in terms of the Italian politics, that they're looking at things from outside, whether they're influenced by sort of patriotic concerns, if they're American or British, and don't want to reveal embarrassing secrets about the role of their own country. That could be a factor. It's possible also that, I mean, I think that this subject matter is still relatively sort of niche area of research in terms of the rest of the world outside Italy. And so, you know, there may be significant documents in archives in London or Washington that local researchers have access to, but they're not possibly looking for, you know, what the documents tell us about Italy. But I do think that it is a big advantage, or it is an advantage, when you have people from another country looking at the history of a neighboring country, that everybody comes with their own prejudices, but it's healthy that they're not Italian prejudices, they're English or American.
It works.
Okay. Okay, so good morning. My name is Raul, and I'm a second-year GG student. I have two questions. The first one related to your experience, and the second to some articles that you wrote. The first one is, since you've been living in Italy for almost 40 years, as much as we've said in the presentation, do you think that due to the fact that the Italian state has not managed to add a stable government, and due to the fact that 3 years ago there were found some armies, some guns and some missiles into far-right parties such as Forza Nuova, there is in Italy the risk of turning back to domestic terrorism? And the second question is, I've read some articles of yours on the Times and on the Guardian, and I wanted to ask, how do you think is for British people or for readers of the London Times of the Guardian to read particular news regarding Italy, such as, for example, one article that you wrote in 2003 regarding Berlusconi's quoting to Libero that he stopped terroristic attack to the Vatican at the Christmas time, or, for example, in more recent time, the ones that you wrote regarding Brothers of Italy, Fratelli d'Italia, that wanted to ban or censorship the two lesbian mothers in Peppa Pig. Thank you so much again.
Yeah, starting with the second question, I think the propaganda and declarations of politicians always have to be taken with a grain of salt, particularly in the case of Berlusconi. He's a very ebullient
sort of volcanic kind of person, and therefore his claims, particularly one needs to view with a certain amount of skepticism. In terms of the lesbian mothers that some members of Fratelli d'Italia objected to, that could be an indicator of the climate within that party, and it's very much remains to be seen how things are going to work out, whether Giorgia Meloni is going to be able to stamp her new moderate, reassuring line on the government and on her own party, and what sort of problems she may have in terms of the risk of disappointing the more extreme members of Fratelli d'Italia. It's certainly going to be a huge challenge for her, with problematic relations with both Berlusconi and Salvini, and potentially problematic relations with people in her own party. In terms of the risk of a return to domestic terrorism, I think that's also is a very it's a good question. The right-wing world around Fratelli d'Italia and parties like Forza Nuova or Casa Pound are obviously going to feel enabled and encouraged by Meloni's victory. And so it will be a challenge for her to sort of keep control of that world and sort of tamp down the more extreme tendencies that exist on the right. There's a story today about an Italian right-wing extremist with links to supremacists white supremacists in the United States, who's been arrested in Bari. So, you know, anything could happen. And I think it's also potentially worrying that this feeling that if people feel that Italy is being governed by an extreme right government, the extreme left will get a new lease of life, and you could see a return of left-wing terrorism. But I do think that probably Italy has moved beyond the context when all of that made sense, or without really making sense, it appeared to make sense. And I think the police and intelligence services now are extremely effective and efficient in Italy. So I would say that I wouldn't be particularly worried about a return to terrorism, either of the left or the right, but one can't rule anything out.
Okay, so this is last question for the first one.
Hello, my name is Elona, and I'm as well a second-year student at Global Governance Tor Vergata. And my question is related to the Vatican, since you said you've been investigating about Vatican popes. And since lately a new show on Netflix came out about Emanuela Orlandi, and I've read many articles. And also yesterday we had the Italian ambassador to the Holy See, and I actually asked this question too, but we couldn't have many answers. I would like to know if you have investigated on this case too, since also the magistrate that was following the case died a few days ago, like if you know anything. And I mean, I know that people say that there are things that people cannot know and secrets that need to be kept, but at the same time, like I feel that when we talk about big institutions like the Vatican, the Holy See, like we can't have these kinds of secrets. So thank you.
Yes, I have looked into the Emanuele Orlandi case, particularly because there's a suggestion that the kidnap was in some way related to the missing money from the Banco Ambrosiano and the Vatican Bank, and that the people who kidnapped Emanuele were trying to get that money back from the Vatican. But of course, there are many other theories and a huge amount of confusion surrounding the case. The connection to Mehmet Ali Agca, an attempt to get his release from prison, suggested connection to sex abuse in the Vatican. So it does, it remains a very, one of the many very mysterious cases. It's curious that these very sensitive mysteries, why is it that some of them remain unsolved for decades and decades, and others, the truth emerges? And if there's a really compact omerta about a case, it tends to indicate that that case is that the truth is something very sensitive and unconfessable. And the fact that even with Pope Francis, who is devoted to turning the page and putting the Vatican scandals behind it, still no really satisfactory contribution to the truth has come from the Vatican. And I know Pietro Orlandi is very frustrated by his meeting with the Pope, and the Pope told him Emanuele is in heaven. But if the Pope knows that, what else does he know, and why is he not saying it? So yes, that is one of these big, persistent mysteries that I certainly don't have an answer to. Well, I have followed it. I've written about it for the paper, and I followed it because of the connection to. It's briefly mentioned in my Calvi book, The Vatican at War. I don't know that there's a Netflix series that many of you may have seen, which I think does a good job at telling the story, although it doesn't solve the mystery either.
So on behalf of all the students, thank you for being here. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you all very much for your questions and for staying awake. And if some of you can become good journalists, then that will be good.
Everyone, please remain on your seats. Paula. We have to start. No one is moving.